There are moments in your life that act like darkroom chemicals, pulling a previously invisible image into sharp, startling focus. For years, you can walk around with the latent image of your own heart held inside you, a blank sheet of paper you've mistaken for the final product. You think you know its landscape, the boundaries of its feelings, the simple, safe composition of it all. And then, a single moment, a shift in the light, a quiet sound, plunges you into the developer, and suddenly a truth you never even knew was there begins to bloom in shades of gray and silver, undeniable and permanent. You can't unsee it. You can't wash it away. The image is there, and your life is now irrevocably divided into the time before you saw it and the time after. For me, that moment arrived on a Tuesday in late October, in the passenger seat of my own beat-up sedan, with Julian at the wheel. We were driving back from a day trip to the coast, a pointless, perfect excursion born of his sudden declaration that the apartment felt too loud with silence. The windows were down, and the air that rushed in was cold and sharp, smelling of pine needles and the distant, briny promise of the ocean we'd just left behind. It whipped my hair across my face and made my eyes water, but it felt clean, like a scouring wind that could carry away the dust that had settled in the quiet corners of our lives. A song we both loved was playing on the stereo, a sprawling, melancholic piece of indie rock that had been the soundtrack to half our late-night study sessions in college. It was a comfortable noise, a familiar texture in the fabric of our friendship. Everything felt normal, easy. It felt like us. And then, with no warning, Julian reached out and turned the music off. The sudden absence of sound was immense, a physical presence that filled the small space of the car. The world outside the windows, the rhythmic thud of the tires on the asphalt, the whistle of the wind, rushed in to fill the void, but it was a different kind of sound. It was the sound of the world happening, not the sound of us choosing our own atmosphere. I turned to look at him, a question forming on my lips, but it dissolved before I could speak. He was staring straight ahead at the darkening road, his hands tight on the steering wheel, his jaw set in a line I recognized. It was the look he got right before a championship swim meet, a combination of intense focus and a deep, churning anxiety. It was a look I had photographed 100 times, but had never once seen directed at anything in his life with me. The silence stretched, pulled taut between us like a wire. I could feel the hum of it in my teeth. I watched the steady rise and fall of his chest, the way the dim light from the dashboard carved shadows under his cheekbones. I was about to say something, anything, to ask if he was tired, to suggest we stop for coffee, to make a stupid joke just to break the tension, but then he spoke. And the way he said my name was the chemical bath that changed everything. Leo, it was too soft. That was the first thing I registered. It wasn't his usual, easy greeting, not the casual way he'd toss my name into a sentence. It was a whisper, a sound meant only for the inches of air between us, so quiet it was almost swallowed by the rushing wind. It held a weight, a fragility, a kind of hesitant reverence that I had never heard in his voice before. It wasn't the name of his friend, his roommate, the guy who always remembered to buy his favorite kind of cereal. It was a name spoken as if it were a fragile object he was afraid of breaking. In that single, whispered syllable, the blank paper of my heart was submerged, and an image began to emerge, an image of a hope I had kept so deeply buried, for so very long, that I had nearly convinced myself it didn't exist at all. I held my breath and waited for the picture to become clear. But to understand that silence, to grasp the sheer, seismic gravity of that one softly spoken word, you have to understand the foundation upon which it landed. You have to understand the years of comfortable, platonic quiet that preceded it. Julian and I had a friendship built in the echoing, chlorine-scented halls of a university aquatic center. He was the star swimmer, a creature of explosive power and fluid grace in the water, a coiled spring of muscle and ambition. I was on the team, technically, but my real place was on the periphery, a quiet observer with a camera, documenting the moments of pain and triumph for the school paper. I was a decent swimmer, but I was a better photographer. I understood light and shadow and the art of capturing a fleeting moment better than I understood the physics of my own kick turn. I saw Julian first through a lens. I saw the tension in his shoulders before he climbed onto the starting block, the fierce, almost feral concentration in his eyes behind his goggles. I saw the exhaustion that hollowed out his face after a grueling practice, the easy camaraderie he shared with everyone, a casual, bright warmth that seemed to radiate from him effortlessly. He was the sun, and the rest of us were planets, content to orbit in his gravitational pull. He was loud and funny and unapologetically alive. I was not. I was quiet, watchful, and lived most of my life inside my own head, composing and cropping the world into manageable frames. Our friendship shouldn't have worked, but it did. It began with a shared class, a brutal organic chemistry course that left us both dazed and confused. We started studying together in the library, our sessions often devolving into whispered jokes and shared bags of stale pretzels. I discovered that beneath his boundless energy was a surprisingly sharp, inquisitive mind, and he seemed to find a strange sort of calm in my quiet presence. He once told me, half joking, that my silence was so profound it actually absorbed the excess noise in his own head. After that, we were inseparable. We became roommates the following year, moving into a cramped, drafty off-campus apartment that always smelled vaguely of damp towels and burnt toast. Those years were a study in comfortable juxtaposition. His side of the living room was a chaotic explosion of textbooks, discarded sweatshirts, and empty protein shake containers. My side was neat, almost sparse, my camera equipment carefully arranged on a dedicated shelf, my books stacked in precise, orderly piles. He filled the apartment with his booming laughter and terrible singing. I filled it with the quiet clicks of my camera shutter and the smell of developing chemicals from the makeshift darkroom I'd set up in our windowless bathroom. He was the one who dragged me to parties, who forced me to be social, who introduced me to people with a proud, proprietary arm slung around my shoulders. I was the one who made sure he ate something other than instant noodles, who listened for hours while he dissected every millisecond of his last race, who could sit with him in complete silence for an entire evening, watching old movies, without feeling the need to say a single word. It was during that time, in the quiet intimacy of our shared life, that the latent image of my feelings for him first formed. It wasn't a sudden revelation. It was a slow, creeping dawn. It was in the casual, unthinking way he would drape an arm over the back of the couch behind my head. It was in the moments I'd find him asleep over a textbook, his face softened and vulnerable, and feel an overwhelming, fiercely protective urge to pull a blanket over him. It was in the genuine, unadulterated joy that would light up his face when one of my photographs won a student award. He was my biggest supporter, my most vocal cheerleader, and he seemed to have no idea that every word of praise from him landed somewhere deep inside my chest and bloomed into a quiet, painful ache. I buried it, of course. I buried it deep. Julian was straight. He had a long-term, on-again, off-again girlfriend, Sarah, a smart, kind woman who I genuinely liked. Their relationship was a fixed point in his universe, a constant I learned to navigate around. Seeing them together was a familiar, manageable kind of pain, a dull throb I could ignore most of the time. I convinced myself that what I felt was just an extension of our friendship, a side effect of our profound closeness. To even consider wanting more felt like a betrayal, a risk that could shatter the most important relationship in my life. The architecture of our friendship was solid, dependable, and I was terrified of being the one to test its foundations. So I became an expert in emotional self-preservation. I built walls inside myself, rooms where my feelings for him could be stored, cataloged, and safely locked away. I continued to look at him through my camera lens, a safe, mechanical barrier that allowed me to admire his beauty without having to fully confront the effect it had on me. The friendship was the masterpiece. My feelings were just the discarded sketches, hidden away in a dusty portfolio. And for years, that was enough. The shift began subtly, a change in the emotional weather that you feel before you can see the clouds gathering. It started the day Julian and Sarah broke up for good. It wasn't a dramatic, explosive end, but a quiet, sad fizzle. A mutual acknowledgement that they were on different paths, that the love they had for each other had transformed into a fond, familial affection that was no longer enough to build a future on. Julian didn't weep or rage. He just deflated. The bright, solar energy that had always defined him seemed to dim, leaving behind a profound and unsettling emptiness. He walked through our apartment like a ghost, his movements slow and aimless, the usual booming soundtrack of his life replaced by a heavy, pervasive silence. He told me about the breakup on a rainy Thursday night. He was sitting on the floor, leaning against the couch, staring at a blank television screen. I was on the sofa, pretending to read, but I had been watching him for an hour, watching the tension in his back, the way he kept running a hand through his hair. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and toneless. "It's over," he said. "With Sarah. For real this time." I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded, placing a bookmark in my novel and setting it aside. He didn't seem to want words. He seemed to want presence. So I stayed, listening to the rain beat against the window pane, listening to the vast, hollow space that had opened up in him. In the weeks that followed, he began to lean on me in a way he never had before. It wasn't about talking through his feelings. Julian had never been good at that. It was something more primal, a need for simple, physical proximity. He stopped spending evenings in his room and instead camped out in the living room, where I was usually working on my photos or reading. He would sprawl out on the rug or curl up on the far end of the couch, saying nothing, just existing in the same space. It was as if my quiet, steady presence was a kind of anchor for him in the turbulent, anchorless sea of his own loneliness. I understood. His world had been neatly mapped out for years, with Sarah as a key landmark. Now that landmark was gone, and he was adrift, searching for a new shoreline. I was just glad to be a harbor, a safe place for him to wait out the storm. But then the boundaries, the carefully drawn lines of our friendship that I had spent years policing, began to blur. It started with the movie nights. We'd always watched movies together, but now they became a nightly ritual. And he started falling asleep. Halfway through a film, his head would start to nod, his breathing would deepen, and he would list sideways until his head was resting on the arm of the couch. The first time it happened, I just watched him for a long time, my heart doing a slow, painful somersault in my chest. He looked so young, so unguarded. I carefully got up, retrieved the worn wool blanket from the back of my armchair, and gently draped it over him. My fingers brushed against his shoulder, and a jolt, hot and electric, shot up my arm. I pulled back as if I'd been burned, my breath catching in my throat. I retreated to my room, my hands shaking, feeling like I had just committed some profound transgression. But he didn't say anything about it the next morning. And it kept happening. Night after night, he would fall asleep on the couch, and I would perform my secret, tender ritual of covering him with the blanket. It became our unspoken routine, a quiet act of care that existed in the space between friendship and something else, something I refused to name. I told myself it was what any good friend would do. He was exhausted, emotionally drained. He needed sleep. He needed comfort. And I could give him that. It was safe. It was just a blanket. But I knew, in a part of my mind I tried to keep locked away, that it was more than that. It was a prayer. It was a confession. It was the only way I could touch him, the only way I could express the vast, aching tenderness I felt for him without using words that would destroy us. The ritual, as I came to think of it, began to evolve. The couch was the first stage, a neutral territory. But our apartment was old and poorly insulated, and as autumn deepened into winter, the nights grew colder. One night, I woke to a soft sound from the living room. I found Julian huddled on the couch, shivering in his sleep, the single blanket clearly not enough. He looked miserable. Without thinking, I went to the linen closet, pulled out a thick comforter, and added it to his makeshift bed. The next morning, he caught me in the kitchen as I was making coffee. "Hey," he said, his voice rough with sleep. "Thanks for the extra blanket." He looked at me, his eyes clear and direct, and for a second I was sure he could see everything, that he knew the frantic, terrified calculus that went into every simple gesture of mine. But he just smiled, a small, tired smile, and added, "It's freezing in here." A week later, the dynamic shifted again. I was in my room, already in bed, reading. It was late, close to 1 in the morning. My door was open a crack, as it always was. I heard his bedroom door open, then the soft creak of floorboards in the hall. I expected him to go to the bathroom or the kitchen. Instead, a shadow fell across my doorway. He was just standing there, a silhouette against the dim light of the hallway. He was holding his pillow. "Leo," he whispered. My heart hammered against my ribs. "Yeah? You okay?" "Bad dream," he said. The words were small, almost childish. Do you mind if I just crash on your floor? My room feels weird tonight." My room felt weird. It was such a strange, flimsy excuse. But I saw the genuine distress in his posture, the way he clutched his pillow like a shield. The logical part of my brain screamed at me to say no, to gently redirect him back to his own bed, to reinforce the boundary. But the part of me that loved him, the part that would have done anything to soothe the anxiety in his voice, won out. "Yeah," I heard myself say, my own voice sounding distant and calm. "Of course. The floor's all yours." He slipped into the room, a quiet shadow, and arranged his pillow and a spare blanket I pointed to on the rug beside my bed. He settled down with a soft sigh. The room fell silent, but it was a new kind of silence. It was dense, charged, filled with the sound of our breathing. I turned off my reading lamp, plunging the room into near darkness, lit only by the faint orange glow of the streetlights outside my window. I lay in my bed, rigid, staring at the ceiling, hyper-aware of his presence just a few feet away. I could hear every time he shifted his weight, every soft exhale. It was exquisite torture. My room, my sanctuary, the one place that was entirely mine, now held him. The walls I had so carefully constructed inside myself felt paper-thin. He was on the other side, breathing in the same air, and I felt utterly, terrifyingly exposed. This became the new phase of the ritual. 2 or 3 nights a week, he would appear at my door, pillow in hand, with a mumbled excuse about a bad dream, or a strange noise, or just an inexplicable feeling of dread. I never questioned him. I just let him in. The open door became a symbol, a silent invitation. I would lie awake for hours after he'd settled on the floor, my senses on high alert, cataloging the geography of his sleep. I learned the rhythm of his breathing, the soft snore that would start an hour in, the way he would sometimes mutter incomprehensible words. It was an intimacy so profound and so deeply strange that it left me breathless. I was a cartographer of his unconscious, mapping a territory I had no right to explore. I was terrified he would wake up one night and find me watching him, that the careful, platonic mask I wore would slip and he would see the raw, unfiltered yearning underneath. The final escalation, the one that shattered the last remnants of plausible deniability, happened during the first real cold snap of the year. The ancient radiator in his bedroom had given up the ghost, and despite our landlord's promises, it remained stubbornly, icily silent. Julian appeared at my door that night, not just with his pillow, but wrapped in his own comforter, visibly shivering. "It's an icebox in there," he chattered, his breath misting in the cool air of the hallway. "I think I can see my breath." I looked at him, then at the small patch of rug beside my bed. It seemed absurd, almost cruel, to make him sleep there. The words left my mouth before I had a chance to stop them. "The floor's going to be freezing too. Just get in." I shifted over to one side of my double bed, creating a space, a chasm of white sheets between us. It felt like I had just detonated a bomb. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, his eyes searching mine in the dim light. I held my breath, waiting for him to laugh it off, to refuse, to recognize the monumental shift this represented. But he just gave a small, grateful nod. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice quiet. "It's a big bed," I said, trying to sound casual, as if this were the most normal thing in the world. "It's stupid for you to freeze on the floor." He moved with a quiet deliberation, shedding his comforter and sliding into the space beside me. The mattress dipped with his weight. He lay on his back, perfectly still, a good foot of space between us. I remained on my side, facing away from him, my entire body a single, clenched muscle. The heat radiating from him was a tangible force, a physical presence in the cold air. I could feel it on my back, on the back of my neck. It felt like standing too close to a fire. I was convinced he could hear the frantic, panicked drumming of my heart. We lay there for what felt like an eternity in a silence that was louder than any conversation we had ever had. "Thanks, Leo," he finally whispered into the dark. "No problem," I managed to choke out. "Get some sleep." I didn't sleep at all that night. I lay awake, tracking the minutes by the changing patterns of light on my ceiling as cars passed on the street below. At some point, deep in the night, he must have turned over in his sleep. An arm, heavy and warm, flopped across my waist. I froze, every nerve ending screaming. It was an unconscious gesture, a simple, reflexive movement in sleep. I knew that, but it felt like a brand. It felt like a claim. My mind raced, trying to file this new data into the carefully constructed narrative of our friendship. He's just cold. He's a restless sleeper. This means nothing. But my body betrayed me. A slow, profound sense of peace began to uncoil in my chest, a feeling of rightness so overwhelming it almost made me want to cry. For the first time in years, the aching space inside me felt full. I lay there under the weight of his arm until the first gray light of dawn began to creep into the room, terrified of the hope that was taking root in the ruins of my carefully guarded heart. This, too, became the new normal. The excuses became thinner, almost perfunctory. My room's still cold. My back hurts from the couch. I just sleep better in here soon. The excuses disappeared altogether. It became an assumption. After our movie, he would just stand up, stretch, and say, "Well, I'm heading to bed," and walk into my room. He had his own pillow there now, his own side of the bed. The chasm of empty sheets between us had gradually narrowed, until some nights I would wake up to find us tangled together, his leg thrown over mine, his face buried in the pillow next to my head. His unconscious need for comfort had completely dismantled my defenses. The open door had led him directly into the heart of my fortress, and he was sleeping peacefully in the throne room, completely unaware of the coup he had staged. And I let him. I let him because I was a coward. I was addicted to this strange, agonizing, beautiful new intimacy. It was a half-life, a fantasy I got to live out only when he was asleep. In the daylight, we were still just Leo and Julian, best friends, roommates. We'd make breakfast, talk about our days, and carefully avoid any mention of the fact that we had spent the night wrapped around each other. The unspoken agreement was a fragile, delicate thing, and I was terrified that a single wrong word, a single lingering look from me, would shatter it into a million pieces. So I said nothing. I existed in a state of suspended animation, caught between the quiet reality of the day and the dreamlike intimacy of the night. I lived for the moments he was asleep, and I dreaded the moments he would wake up. I was a photographer living in a state of perfect, prolonged exposure, capturing an image of a life I wanted so badly, knowing that the slightest movement could blur the picture beyond recognition, leaving me with nothing but a ghost of what might have been. Which brings us back to the car, back to the sudden, shocking silence and the sound of my name, spoken to softly into the rushing wind. We were driving back from that day trip to the coast, a day that had felt so wonderfully, achingly normal. We had walked along the beach in the cold October sun, skipping stones across the flat, gray water. We'd eaten greasy fish and chips out of a cardboard box, huddled together on a bench to shield ourselves from the wind. It had felt like one of our old college days, easy and uncomplicated. The nighttime ritual, the unspoken thing that now lived in my bedroom, felt a million miles away. For a few hours, we were just friends again, and while a part of me mourned the loss of the nighttime closeness, another, larger part felt a profound sense of relief. It was a vacation from the tension, a return to the safety of the known. But as we drove home, as the sun set and the world outside the car dissolved into a blur of dark trees and fleeting headlights, the atmosphere began to shift. The easy silence between us grew heavier, more thoughtful. I could feel him glancing over at me from time to time, a quick, unreadable look. I kept my own eyes fixed on the road ahead, afraid of what I might see in his if I looked too long. I was trying to rebuild the comfortable walls of our friendship, brick by familiar brick, but it felt like trying to build a sandcastle against a rising tide. The intimacy of the past few months had changed the landscape between us permanently. When he turned the music off, it was like he had cut the last thread holding that fragile illusion of normalcy together. The silence that filled the car wasn't empty. It was full of everything we hadn't been saying for weeks. It was full of the weight of his arm across my waist in the middle of the night, the sound of his breathing in my ear, the sight of his pillow sitting on my bed as if it had always belonged there. It was a silence so dense I felt like I could barely breathe. And then he said my name. Leo. I finally turned to look at him. His face was cast in the eerie green and orange glow of the dashboard. He was still looking at the road, but his focus wasn't there. His eyes were distant, lost somewhere in the middle distance. His knuckles were white on the steering wheel. Yeah, I said, and my voice was a stranger's, thin and tight. He swallowed, a small, audible sound in the quiet car. He took a deep breath, and for a moment, I thought he was going to pull over. I thought he was going to have a panic attack. I thought he was going to finally say the words that would end everything. The words that would gently but firmly put me back in my place, that would apologize for the confusion and reestablish the boundaries. I braced myself for the impact. Instead, he kept driving, but his gaze flickered from the road to me, just for a second. And in that second, I saw something in his eyes I had never seen before. It wasn't just anxiety or confusion. It was fear, yes, but it was tangled up with something else. Something that looked terrifyingly like longing. He turned his attention back to the road. Another mile of tense silence passed. The car felt like a pressure cooker. I had to say something. Julian, are you okay? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He didn't answer right away. He just kept driving, his expression unreadable. Then, so quietly I almost missed it over the sound of the engine, he said, I don't know. He let out a shaky breath. I think I'm going to pull over, he signaled and guided the car onto the gravel shoulder of the empty country road. He killed the engine. The sudden, total silence was absolute. The only light came from the moon, a pale, watery silver that filtered through the windshield. He didn't turn to me. He just sat there, his hands still gripping the steering wheel, his head bowed slightly. Julian, what's going on? I pressed, my voice trembling slightly. You can talk to me. He finally released his grip on the wheel and let his hands fall into his lap. He turned his head and looked at me. His eyes were dark pools of shadow in the faint moonlight, but I could see the raw vulnerability in them. The carefully constructed mask of the easygoing, confident athlete was gone. In its place was someone I had never met before, someone lost and uncertain and achingly open. I can't stop thinking, he whispered. The words were a plume of white vapor in the cold air. Thinking about what? He shook his head, a small, helpless gesture. About sleeping. In your room. In your bed. He said the words like a confession, like he was admitting to a crime. I keep telling myself there are reasons. It's warmer. I have nightmares. My radiator's broken. But they're not the real reasons. My blood ran cold. This was it. The moment of reckoning. What's the real reason, Julian? I asked, my voice dangerously steady. He held my gaze, and the world seemed to shrink until it was nothing but the space between us in that cold, dark car. The real reason, he said, his voice cracking on the last word, is that it's the only place I feel quiet. The only place my head stops screaming at me. The only place I feel safe. He paused, taking another shaky breath. It's because you're there. The admission hung in the air between us, fragile and terrifying. It was more than I had ever dared to hope for, and yet it was still so terrifyingly ambiguous. Safe. Quiet. Those were the words of friendship, of comfort. But the way he was looking at me, the desperate, pleading intensity in his eyes, that was something else entirely. I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, and he was asking me to jump, but I couldn't be sure if he was going to jump with me or just watch me fall. I didn't know what to say. My entire vocabulary had deserted me. All the words I had ever known seemed inadequate to respond to the beautiful, terrifying truth he had just laid at my feet. So I just sat there, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs, and I waited. He seemed to take my silence as a kind of permission. He slowly, tentatively, reached a hand across the center console. He didn't try to take my hand. He just let his rest on the seat between us, his palm turned up. An offering. A question. I looked down at his hand, then back up at his face. And then, with a tremor that seemed to start deep in my soul, I reached out and placed my hand in his. His fingers closed around mine, his grip surprisingly strong, desperate. His skin was cold, but a current of warmth shot through me, a powerful, undeniable jolt of connection. He let out a long, shuddering breath, as if he had been holding it for weeks. He didn't pull his hand away. He just held mine, his thumb stroking softly over my knuckles. We sat like that for a long time, in the quiet, silvered darkness, the silence no longer tense, but filled with a new, fragile understanding. Finally, he spoke again, his voice a raw whisper. "Leo." "Yeah." He turned his body slightly towards me, his face now only inches from mine. I could smell the salt from the ocean on his skin. I could see the faint constellation of freckles across his nose. "Would it be okay?" he began, his voice trembling with a vulnerability that shattered my heart into 1,000 pieces. "If I kissed you?" The question was the final developer, the stop bath, the fixer. The image was complete. It was a picture of him, looking at me with a mixture of terror and hope that mirrored my own. It was a picture of my own hand, held tightly in his. It was a picture of the end of one life and the beginning of another. All the years of silent yearning, of carefully guarded feelings, of hopeless, secret pining, coalesced into a single, blindingly clear point of light. I couldn't speak. I could only nod, a small, jerky movement. And then he leaned in, and the world fell away. The kiss was nothing like I had ever imagined. It wasn't passionate or demanding. It was tentative, soft, a question asked with his lips instead of his voice. It was a taste of salt and cold air and a desperate, unspoken need. It was clumsy and hesitant and utterly, breathtakingly perfect. It was a quiet confirmation of a truth that had been hiding in plain sight for years. When he pulled back, he rested his forehead against mine, his eyes closed. We were both breathing heavily, our breath mingling in the cold air. "Okay," he whispered, more to himself than to me. "Okay." I had no idea what that okay meant. Was it okay, I've done it, now I know? Or was it okay, this is real, this is happening? The ambiguity was terrifying, but for the first time, it was an ambiguity I was a part of, not just an observer of. I brought my other hand up and rested it on his cheek. He leaned into my touch, a soft, involuntary sigh escaping his lips. In that moment, in the dark, silent bubble of the car, everything felt possible. The carefully constructed walls had been breached, the latent image was fully developed, and I had no idea what to do with the beautiful, terrifying photograph I was now holding in my hands. The drive back to the apartment was conducted in a profound, altered silence. It wasn't the tense, questioning silence from before, nor was it the comfortable, easy silence of our old friendship. It was something new, a space shimmering with unspoken potential and a heavy dose of fear. He held my hand the entire way, his thumb never ceasing its soft, rhythmic stroking over my knuckles. Neither of us spoke. There were no words for what had just happened, no language we knew how to use to navigate this new, uncharted territory. When we finally pulled into our parking spot, he shut off the car, and we just sat there for another minute, our hands still entwined, the reality of what we had done slowly settling in. The spell was broken when he finally released my hand, the loss of his touch leaving my skin feeling cold and strangely empty. "We should go in," he said, his voice quiet, almost formal. He didn't look at me. He just opened his door and got out, and I followed suit, my legs feeling unsteady beneath me. The short walk to our apartment door felt like a mile. I was acutely aware of the space between us, a space that a few minutes ago had been filled with a shocking, revelatory intimacy and was now a chasm of uncertainty. Inside, the familiar comfort of our shared space felt alien. The air was thick with it. He tossed his keys on the small table by the door and kicked off his shoes, his movements stiff and unnatural. He still wasn't looking at me. I'm really tired," he mumbled, his gaze fixed on the floor. "I think I'm just going to turn in." My heart sank. It was the coward's way out, a retreat to neutrality. I wanted to scream. I wanted to grab him and shake him and demand to know what that kiss had meant. I wanted to drag him into the light and force him to look at the thing we had just created together. But I just nodded. "Okay," I said, my own voice tight. "Yeah, me too." He gave a curt nod and then, without another word, he turned and walked down the hall. I listened, my breath held, for the sound of his footsteps turning towards my room. It was the moment of truth. Would the ritual continue? Would the unspoken rule still apply? But his footsteps didn't falter. They continued past my open door, and I heard the soft click of his own bedroom door closing. A door that hadn't been fully closed in months. The sound was a gunshot in the quiet apartment. It was a verdict. It was a rejection. I stood frozen in the living room, the echo of that click reverberating through my entire body. I felt stupid. I felt naive. I had mistaken a moment of confused, desperate vulnerability for a genuine confession of feeling. He had been adrift, and I had been a temporary harbor, but now, it seemed, the storm had passed, and he was ready to set sail again, leaving me behind on the shore. The hope that had bloomed so violently in the car withered and died, leaving a bitter, ashen taste in my mouth. I walked to my room and closed my own door, the vast, empty space of my bed mocking me. The silence from his side of the apartment was absolute, and for the first time in a very long time, I felt completely, utterly alone. The next few days were a masterclass in avoidance. Julian became a ghost in his own home. He was gone before I woke up in the mornings, a hastily rinsed coffee mug in the sink, the only evidence he'd been there at all. He came home late at night, long after I had given up waiting and retreated to my room. We communicated through terse, impersonal text messages. "Working late tonight. Don't wait up. Can you pick up milk?" The vibrant, lived-in warmth of our apartment evaporated, replaced by the sterile, polite chill of two strangers sharing a living space. The closed door of his bedroom was a constant, painful reminder of the line he had drawn between us. He had crossed a boundary only to immediately retreat and build a wall in its place. I was drowning in a sea of confusion and hurt. I replayed the kiss, the conversation in the car, over and over again in my mind, searching for clues I might have missed. Had I misinterpreted everything? Was his confession about feeling safe with me just that? A confession of friendship that I, in my hopeful delusion, had twisted into something more? Had the kiss been a mistake, an impulsive act born of emotional turmoil that he now deeply regretted? The uncertainty was eating me alive. The quiet observer in me, the photographer who was so good at seeing the truth in things, was completely blind. I had no frame of reference for this, no way to compose the chaos of my feelings into a coherent picture. After a week of this agonizing silence, I couldn't take it anymore. The not knowing was worse than a definitive rejection. I needed to understand. I needed to hear it from him, whatever it was. I spent the entire day rehearsing what I would say, my stomach twisting itself into knots. I decided to wait for him that evening, no matter how late he came home. I would not let him slip past me into the safety of his room. We were going to talk. He finally came home just after 11. I heard his key in the lock, and my heart began to pound against my ribs. I was sitting on the couch in the dark, waiting. The living room was lit only by the faint glow of the city outside. He stepped inside, his shoulders slumped with exhaustion. He didn't see me at first. He dropped his bag by the door with a heavy thud and started to head down the hall. "Julian," I said, my voice cutting through the silence. He froze, his back to me. He stood there for a long moment before he slowly turned around. In the dim light, I could see the surprise and dread on his face. He looked like a cornered animal. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. He let out a long, weary sigh and ran a hand over his face. "Leo, I'm really tired. Can we not do this tonight?" "No," I said, the word sharper than I intended. "We're doing this now." I stood up, facing him across the shadowed expanse of the living room. What happened in the car, Julian? What was that? And what is this? I gestured to the empty, silent space between us. This week has been hell. You disappear. You avoid me. You shut your door. You kiss me like you mean it, and then you treat me like I don't exist. You owe me an explanation. He flinched at my words, but he didn't run. He walked slowly into the living room and sank into the armchair opposite the couch, his face buried in his hands. His voice, when he finally spoke, was muffled and full of self-loathing. I know. I'm sorry. I've been a coward. Why? I asked, the single word hanging in the air. He looked up at me, his eyes filled with a desperate, painful confusion. Because I'm scared, Leo, he whispered. I'm terrified. That kiss, it wasn't a mistake. That's what scares me. It felt right. More right than anything has felt in a very long time. And I don't know what to do with that feeling. He shook his head, his gaze dropping to the floor. This isn't my life. This isn't who I am. I date women. I've always dated women. My family, my friends, everyone, they have this idea of who I am. I have this idea of who I am. And that kiss, that feeling, it doesn't fit into any of it. It's like I've been living my whole life in this house that I thought I knew, and I just found a door to a room I never knew existed. And I'm afraid to open it. I'm afraid of what's inside. His confession washed over me, a wave of understanding that extinguished the anger and left only a deep, profound sadness in its place. He wasn't rejecting me. He was rejecting himself. He was fighting a war inside his own head, and I was just collateral damage. The hurt was still there, a sharp stone in my chest, but it was now tempered with a painful empathy. So what? I asked, my voice softer now. So you just pretend that door isn't there? You pretend that kiss never happened? You throw away this? I gestured between us again. Whatever this is, because you're scared of what people might think. Because you're scared of a room you haven't even looked inside yet. I don't know, he exclaimed, his voice rising with frustration and despair. I don't know what I'm doing, Leo. All I know is that when I'm near you, all the noise in my head stops. And after that kiss, there's a new noise, and it's louder than all the others. And I don't know how to make it stop. So I ran. I thought if I just put some distance between us, it would go away. That things would go back to normal, and did they? I asked quietly. He let out a short, bitter laugh. No, it's a million times worse. The apartment feels empty. I can't sleep. The silence is deafening. Turns out, the thing I was running from is the only thing I actually want. His voice broke on the last few words, and he looked at me, his eyes shining with unshed tears. I'm so sorry, Leo. I've hurt you. I took your friendship, your comfort, your kindness, and I've made a complete mess of it because I'm too much of a coward to deal with my own life. I walked over and sat on the coffee table in front of him, bringing myself to his level. The anger was gone, replaced by a weary tenderness. You didn't make a mess of it, Julian, I said softly. We did. Together. But you're right. You have to figure out what you want. You have to decide if you're brave enough to open that door. And I can't make that decision for you. I took a deep breath, the next words tasting like glass in my mouth. But I also can't live like this. In this limbo, waiting for you to maybe, possibly, one day, figure it out. It's not fair to me, he nodded, his gaze fixed on his own tightly clasped hands. I know, so you need to take some time, I continued, the words feeling both necessary and excruciating. Real time. And you need to be honest with yourself. And when you know what you want, you know where I am. I stood up, the movement feeling final and heavy. I'm going to bed. Good night, Julian. I walked away, leaving him sitting alone in the dark. This time, when I closed my bedroom door, it didn't feel like a rejection. It felt like a boundary. It felt like self-preservation. It was the hardest thing I had ever done, walking away from him when all I wanted to do was hold him and tell him it would all be okay. But I knew it wouldn't be okay until he decided to make it okay. The ball was in his court, and all I could do now was wait and hope that he was brave enough to pick it up. The week that followed was the quietest of my life. The silence in the apartment was no longer charged with unspoken tension. It was a heavy, mournful vacuum. We moved around each other with a gentle, sad courtesy, like two people grieving the same loss. He started sleeping in his own room again, every single night. The closed door between us was no longer a symbol of his panic, but of the space I had demanded. It was a space for him to think, and a space for me to protect my own heart from being shattered any further. I threw myself into my work, spending long hours in the darkroom, the smell of chemicals a comfort, the slow emergence of images a welcome distraction. I was developing pictures of strangers, of landscapes, of anything and everything that wasn't him. I was trying to focus my world back into a shape that didn't have him at its center. It wasn't working. I had resigned myself to the idea that I had lost him, perhaps not as a roommate, but as a friend, as the central pillar of my life. The intimacy we had shared felt like a dream I was slowly, painfully waking up from. I had to believe that our friendship, the solid foundation we had built over years, was strong enough to survive this. Maybe, in time, we could go back. Maybe we could rebuild the comfortable, platonic structure we had before. But the thought of it felt like a consolation prize, a black and white photograph of a world I now knew could exist in brilliant, terrifying color. Then, one evening, about 10 days after our confrontation, I was in my darkroom, which was, of course, the apartment's main bathroom, with the red safe light casting an eerie, monastic glow over everything. I was carefully agitating a tray of developer, watching an image of a rain-slicked city street slowly appear on the paper. There was a soft knock on the door. Not the bathroom door, but my bedroom door, which was just down the hall. My heart skipped a beat. It was Julian. We hadn't knocked on each other's doors in years. "Leo," he called out, his voice soft, hesitant. "I'm in the darkroom." I called back, my own voice sounding rough. "Give me a minute." I quickly moved the print to the stop bath, my hands trembling slightly. I rinsed my fingers, turned on the main light, and stepped out of the bathroom, blinking in the sudden brightness. He was standing in the hallway, just outside my bedroom. He looked nervous, his hands shoved into the pockets of his jeans. "Hey," he said. "Hey," I replied, leaning against the doorframe, crossing my arms over my chest. A defensive posture. "What's up?" He took a deep breath, like a swimmer preparing to dive. "Can we talk?" "In your room." My room. The scene of the crime. The space that had held all our unspoken intimacy. I hesitated for a second, then nodded and pushed the door open, stepping aside to let him pass. I followed him in and closed the door behind us, the soft click echoing the sound that had started this whole painful chapter. He didn't sit on the bed. He just stood in the middle of the room, looking around as if seeing it for the first time. His gaze fell on his pillow, which I hadn't had the heart to move from its place at the head of my bed. He finally turned to face me. His eyes were clear and steady. The frantic, terrified confusion was gone, replaced by a quiet, sober resolve. "You were right," he began, his voice low but firm. "I was a coward. I was so scared of that door, of that room I didn't know, that I was willing to burn down the whole house just to avoid opening it." He took a step closer to me. "I spent the last week doing what you said. I was honest with myself. Brutally honest. I thought about my life, about Sarah, about everything I thought I was supposed to be. And then I thought about you." He paused, and his gaze was so intense it felt like a physical touch. "Everything is louder when you're not there, Leo. The silence you used to absorb for me, it's gone, and all the noise is back. But it's different now, because underneath it all, there's this new quiet. And it's you. It's the thought of you, the feeling of your hand in mine, the memory of your head on the pillow next to mine." He took another step. We were barely a foot apart now. I was wrong. That room I was so scared of? It's not some strange, terrifying place. I think it's the only room I've ever actually wanted to be in. It's the place I feel the most like myself. And it's not a room. It's you. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't speak. I could only listen as he finally gave voice to the truth. "I don't have it all figured out," he continued, a note of raw vulnerability creeping back into his voice. "I don't know what this looks like, or what we tell people, or what any of it means for the future. I'm still scared. But I know one thing for sure." He reached out and gently took my hands in his. His were warm. "I know that I'm more scared of losing you than I am of any of that. I am done running away from the one thing that feels like home." He looked at me, his eyes pleading. "I don't know if it's too late. I don't know if I've ruined everything. But I'm asking you, can we try? Can we open that door together? The tears I had been holding back for weeks finally fell. They traced hot paths down my cheeks. I looked at our joined hands, then back up at his beautiful, earnest, terrified face. And I saw my future. It wasn't a neat, pre-packaged life. It was uncertain and probably complicated. But it was real. And it was with him. I gave him a watery, trembling smile. "The door's been open the whole time, Julian," I whispered. "I was just waiting for you to walk through it." A look of profound, staggering relief washed over his face. He surged forward and wrapped his arms around me, burying his face in my shoulder. I held him tightly, my own arms circling his back, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, I could breathe again. We just stood there, in the middle of my room, holding on to each other, two separate, broken pieces finally fitting together. There were no more words. There was no need for them. We had found a new language, a quiet, honest truth that existed in the space between our heartbeats. That night, he slept in my bed again. But this time, it was different. There were no pretenses, no excuses. There was no chasm of empty sheets between us. He pulled me close, his arms securely around my waist, my head resting on his chest. I could feel the steady, reassuring rhythm of his heart beneath my ear. The door was closed, not to shut the world out, but to keep us in, to create a safe, deliberate space that belonged only to us. It wasn't a half-life, a borrowed intimacy. It was a conscious choice. It was the beginning of our new normal. In the morning, I woke up to the smell of coffee. I opened my eyes to find Julian sitting on the edge of the bed, fully dressed, holding two mugs. He was watching me, a small, gentle smile on his face. The morning light streamed in through the window, catching the gold in his hair. I took the mug he offered, our fingers brushing. The simple, domestic intimacy of the moment was more profound than any grand, romantic gesture could ever have been. We didn't talk much. We just drank our coffee, our shoulders touching, the silence between us easy and full, pregnant with a quiet, joyful peace. The apartment no longer felt empty. It felt like home. It wasn't a magic fix. There were still moments of fear, of uncertainty. There were conversations to be had, a new life to be navigated. But the foundation had been reset. The ambiguity that had nearly destroyed us was gone, replaced by a shared commitment to honesty. We learned to talk, to voice our fears, to reassure each other. He learned to name his feelings, and I learned to believe I was worthy of hearing them. We were no longer just the unknowing initiator and the quiet observer. We were two people learning how to build something new, something real, together. I think back to that moment in the car, the moment the music stopped and the world held its breath. It was the chemical bath, the catalyst that forced the image of us into existence. But a photograph isn't just made in the developer. It needs the stop bath to halt the chaos, the fixer to make it permanent. Our painful week of silence, our raw, honest confrontation, the final, brave confession, those were the final steps in the process. They took the fleeting, ephemeral image of what we could be and made it real, made it lasting. We created something permanent out of the shadows and light of our own fear and longing. And now, when I look at him, sleeping peacefully beside me in the early morning light, I see the final, perfect print. It's a picture of home, and it's the most beautiful thing I have ever seen. We began to heal in the beautiful, honest silence we'd learned to create together.